The waitress was fired for theft on a luxury cruise ship, and the millionaire saw her necklace, the same one he gave his daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. The grand ballroom of the luxury cruise ship shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of lively conversation filled the air as elegantly dressed guests reveled in the splendor of the evening. For Chloe, the night felt like any other. She moved swiftly between tables, balancing a tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease, offering her polite smile to the wealthy passengers who barely noticed her presence. But tonight, something felt off. She had overheard whispers among the staff earlier, a vague tension in their voices about thefts aboard the ship. Chloe brushed it off, focusing instead on her shift and dreaming of the day she might afford her own piece of luxury, far from the world of serving others. It all changed in an instant. "Excuse me, miss," a sharp voice called out. Chloe turned to see the maitre d', Mr. Harding, flanked by 2 security guards. His expression was cold, his eyes accusing. "We need to speak with you immediately." Chloe's heart sank. Heads began to turn. The murmurs started before she even had a chance to speak. "What's this about?" she asked, forcing a steady tone despite the knot forming in her stomach. Harding crossed his arms, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Several valuable items have gone missing tonight, and we have reason to believe you're involved. Please come with us." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true. I've done nothing wrong." The guests stared, their eyes burning with curiosity and judgment. She searched the crowd for a sympathetic face but found none. Even her co-workers avoided her gaze, pretending to be engrossed in their tasks. "You can explain yourself to security," Harding said curtly, motioning for the guards. As they guided her out of the ballroom, Chloe's hands trembled. The humiliation was suffocating. She could feel the weight of the stairs behind her, the whispers growing louder with every step. Among the onlookers, one man's attention lingered longer than the rest. Matthew Carter, seated at a prime table near the center of the room, had barely paid attention to the scene, until his eyes caught the delicate star-shaped pendant around Chloe's neck. Matthew's breath hitched. That pendant? It was impossible. He had seen it before, years ago, when he had placed it around the neck of his daughter, Haley, as a birthday gift. She had been just 5 years old at the time, her giggles filling the room as she spun around to admire how the diamonds sparkled in the light. But Haley had been gone for 20 years. The memory hit him like a wave, and for a moment, the bustling ballroom faded into silence. Could it really be the same pendant? And if so, how did this young waitress come to possess it? Matthew rose from his seat, his mind racing. He excused himself from the table, barely acknowledging the polite inquiries of his business associates. By the time he reached the corridor, Chloe was seated in a small office, her face pale and tear-streaked as she tried to explain herself to the ship's head of security. "I swear I didn't take anything," Chloe said, her voice breaking. "Check my locker, my bag. Whatever you want, I don't have anything that isn't mine." Matthew hesitated outside the door. He didn't know this young woman, yet something about her, beyond the pendant, drew him in. Finally, he knocked lightly and stepped inside. The head of security, a burly man with a stern demeanor, looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Matthew said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak to her, alone." Chloe looked up in surprise, her red-rimmed eyes meeting his. She didn't recognize him, but something in his gaze was oddly reassuring. The head of security frowned but relented. Stepping out of the room with a warning glance at Chloe, Matthew took a seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her, his gaze flickering from her face to the pendant resting against her collarbone. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," he began gently. "But that necklace, where did you get it?" Chloe blinked, caught off guard. It was my mother's. And where did she get it?" I don't know," Chloe admitted. "She gave it to me before she passed away. She said it was special, but she never explained why." Matthew's throat tightened. He leaned back, trying to process the flood of emotions swirling within him. "Your mother, was she your biological mother?" "No," Chloe said hesitantly. "I was adopted." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Matthew's mind reeled with possibilities, each more implausible yet more compelling than the last. "Do you know anything about your birth family?" he asked. his voice barely above a whisper. Chloe shook her head. No, I was found in a small village in Florida when I was a baby. That's all I know. Matthew sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. The pendant, the adoption, the timeline. It all lined up too perfectly to be a coincidence. Chloe, he said carefully, I need to know everything you can remember about that village. It's important. Chloe hesitated, but the sincerity in his voice broke through her defenses. Why? What does this have to do with me? Matthew met her gaze, his expression solemn. Because that pendant, it belonged to my daughter. She disappeared 20 years ago. The room fell silent as Chloe stared at Matthew, her confusion evident. Your daughter, she echoed, her voice shaky. What does this have to do with me? Matthew leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the pendant. This isn't just any necklace. I gave that pendant to my daughter, Haley, on her 5th birthday. She disappeared 20 years ago. And now I see it around your neck. That can't be a coincidence. Chloe's mind raced. She wanted to push back, to tell him that he must be mistaken, but the intensity in his voice held her back. I don't know what to tell you, she said finally. It was my mom's, or my adoptive mom's. She gave it to me before she passed away. What was her name? Matthew asked quickly. Karen, Chloe replied. Karen Mitchell. She raised me since I was a baby. She told me she found me in a small village in Florida. But that's all I know. Matthew's hands tightened into fists as a flood of memories hit him. Haley had vanished during a family vacation in Florida. They'd spent weeks combing the coastline, questioning every witness, but she had disappeared without a trace. And now, 2 decades later, this young woman was sitting before him, wearing the very pendant he had given her. Do you remember anything about where Karen found you? Matthew pressed. Chloe hesitated. Not much, she admitted. She didn't like to talk about it. She just said it was a quiet village near the water. That's all I know. Matthew sat back, running a hand through his hair. The pieces were starting to align, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Do you have anything else from her? Documents? Photos? Anything that might give us more information? Chloe shook her head. No. Everything was lost when she passed. It was just me and this necklace. Before Matthew could respond, the door swung open, and the head of security re-entered, his expression impatient. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We're still investigating the matter at hand. Matthew stood, his demeanor calm but resolute. I understand, he said, glancing back at Chloe. But this isn't over. I'll find out the truth. As Matthew left, Chloe's shoulders slumped. She was exhausted, confused, and still reeling from the accusation of theft. She didn't know whether to believe Matthew's story or dismiss it as the ramblings of a desperate man. But the way he had looked at her, like she was the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for years, left her unsettled. Matthew returned to his suite, his thoughts a whirlwind. He couldn't shake the image of Chloe's face. There was something about her, beyond the pendant, that struck a chord deep within him. She had Haley's eyes, her posture, the way she spoke. It all felt eerily familiar. Pulling out his laptop, Matthew began searching for any information he could find. He scoured archives and old reports from Haley's disappearance, looking for anything that might connect the dots. The timeline matched. Chloe's age. The location Karen had mentioned. It all pointed to the impossible, but there was something else gnawing at him. Veronica, his younger sister, had always been overly involved during the search for Haley. At the time, he had appreciated her support, but in hindsight, some of her actions didn't add up. Why had she insisted on taking over certain parts of the investigation? Why had she been so adamant about ruling out certain leads? Matthew frowned. He couldn't jump to conclusions, but his gut told him there was more to the story. Picking up his phone, he dialed the number of a trusted investigator he hadn't spoken to in years. Back in her small cabin, Chloe sat on her bunk, turning the pendant over in her hands. Her mind was racing. The accusation of theft, the strange confrontation with Matthew, the revelation about her adoption. It was too much to process. Why now? She whispered to herself. Why is this happening now? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. One of her co-workers, Elena, poked her head in. Hey, are you okay? I heard what happened. Chloe managed a weak smile. I don't know. Everything's a mess right now. Elena stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Listen, I don't know what's really going on, but you should be careful. There's been talk among the staff about things going missing, about certain people being involved. What do you mean? Chloe asked, her brow furrowing. I mean, some people on this ship aren't who they seem to be, Elena said in a hushed tone. I've seen things. Packages being moved in the middle of the night, people sneaking around. It's not just about the guests. Chloe's heart sank. Are you saying someone set me up? Elena hesitated, then nodded. I think so, and I think it's bigger than you realize. Chloe's mind reeled. Could this have something to do with the accusation against her? Was someone trying to frame her for something much larger? The next morning, Matthew met with the ship's captain, hoping to gain access to Chloe's employment records. I just need to know more about her, he said. It's personal. The captain hesitated. Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns, but this is a sensitive matter. We can't disclose personal information about our employees without proper cause. I can provide you with all the cause you need, Matthew countered, his tone sharp. Do you have any idea what's at stake here? The captain sighed. I'll see what I can do, but this could take time. As Matthew left the captain's office, his phone buzzed. It was the investigator he had called the night before. I've got some preliminary information, the voice on the other end said. But you're not going to like it. What is it? Matthew asked. Let's just say there are people close to you who might not want you to find out the truth. Chloe woke up to the hum of the ship's engines, her head still spinning from the events of the previous day, the accusations, the confrontation with Matthew, and Elena's warning about hidden activities on the ship swirled in her mind like a storm. She hadn't slept much, the weight of uncertainty pressing heavily on her chest. The knock on her cabin door came too early. Chloe sat up, startled, and called out, "Who is it?" "It's security," came the gruff reply. Her stomach dropped. What now? Opening the door cautiously, she was greeted by two stern-faced guards. "You need to come with us," one of them said. "For what?" she demanded, her voice laced with exhaustion and frustration. "Routine questioning," the other guard replied, though his tone suggested it was anything but routine. Chloe sighed, slipping on her shoes and grabbing her pendant almost instinctively. "Fine, let's get this over with." In the dimly lit security office, Chloe sat under the harsh glare of a single overhead light. Across from her, the head of security leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Miss Mitchell, Miss, we've received further reports of missing items, jewelry, wallets, high-value goods," he began, shuffling papers on his desk. "And all evidence seems to point back to you." Chloe clenched her fists. "That's ridiculous. I haven't stolen anything." The man raised an eyebrow. "Then explain why your locker was found open last night, with several pieces of stolen property inside." "What?" Chloe's voice broke. "That's not possible. I didn't—" "Save it," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "We're conducting a full investigation until we sort this out. You're officially barred from all staff areas except your cabin, and if we find more evidence, we'll hand this over to the authorities when we dock." Chloe felt her world collapsing further. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Prove it," he replied coldly, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. As Chloe walked back to her cabin, her mind raced. Someone was framing her. That much was clear. But who and why? The memory of Elena's warning echoed in her mind. Some people on the ship aren't who they seem to be. Once inside her cabin, Chloe paced nervously. She couldn't sit still, not with so many unanswered questions. Grabbing her pendant again, she stared at it, hoping for some kind of clarity. "Mom," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "What's going on? Why does everything feel like it's falling apart?" Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, it was Elena. "Chloe," Elena said softly as she stepped inside, her expression serious. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" "No, I'm not okay," Chloe admitted, her voice trembling. "They found stolen stuff in my locker, stuff I didn't put there." Elena frowned. "I had a feeling this would happen. Look, I don't know all the details, but I've seen things, packages being moved late at night, strange meetings between certain crew members and guests. It's not just about theft. There's something bigger going on. Like what? Chloe asked, desperate for answers. Elena hesitated, then leaned in closer. I think there's a smuggling operation on this ship, and I think they're using you as a scapegoat to cover it up. Meanwhile, Matthew sat in his suite, staring at the documents his investigator had sent him. The more he read, the clearer it became that Chloe's story lined up with his daughter's disappearance. The timeline, the location, the pendant. It was all too perfect. But one name kept coming up in the reports. Veronica. Matthew couldn't ignore it any longer. His sister had been heavily involved in the search for Haley. But now, cracks were beginning to appear in the narrative. Why had she insisted on ruling out the lead about the Florida village? Why had she pushed him to focus on other areas instead? Picking up his phone, Matthew called his investigator. I need you to dig deeper into Veronica, he said, his voice firm. I want to know everything she's been hiding. The investigator hesitated. That might take time. If she's involved, she's covered her tracks well. Do whatever it takes, Matthew replied. I need the truth. That evening, Chloe decided to take matters into her own hands. If she was being set up, she needed to find proof. She slipped out of her cabin and headed to the lower decks, where Elena had mentioned seeing suspicious activity as she crept through the dimly lit corridors. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she couldn't afford to let fear stop her. Suddenly, voices echoed from around the corner. Chloe pressed herself against the wall, straining to listen. Shipment is secure, one voice said. Good, another replied. We can't afford any more slip-ups. That waitress is drawing too much attention. Chloe's blood ran cold. They were talking about her. What do we do if she figures it out? She won't, the first voice said confidently. She's already being watched. One wrong move and she's done. The voices faded as the men walked away, leaving Chloe trembling in the shadows. It was true. She was being framed as part of a larger operation. Gathering her courage, she made her way back to her cabin, her mind racing with plans. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to find someone who could help her, someone she could trust. Her thoughts drifted to Matthew. He had seemed genuinely concerned about her and the pendant. Maybe, just maybe, he would listen. In his suite, Matthew was deep in thought when his phone buzzed. It was the investigator again. I found something, the voice said, urgency in his tone. What is it? Matthew asked. It's about Veronica. The investigator replied. She's been hiding a lot more than you think. Chloe stood at her cabin window, staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her mind, and the realization that she was being framed for something far bigger than petty theft sent chills down her spine. She clutched the pendant around her neck, her only connection to the life she'd known, and whispered to herself, What am I supposed to do now? A firm knock at the door startled her. Who is it? She asked cautiously. It's Matthew Carter, came the reply. Chloe hesitated. She didn't fully trust him yet, but deep down, she felt he might be her only ally. Opening the door, she found Matthew standing there, his expression a mix of urgency and determination. Can I come in? He asked. Chloe stepped aside, nodding. Sure, but if this is about accusing me of something, you can save your breath. Matthew shook his head as he entered. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I believe you, Chloe. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. You do. Yes, Matthew said firmly. I've been looking into everything. The thefts, the pendant, your story, and none of it adds up. I think you're caught in something much bigger, and I want to help you figure it out. Chloe crossed her arms, studying him carefully. Why would you care? You don't even know me. Matthew hesitated, then met her gaze. Because if what I suspect is true, you're not just some waitress who got framed. You might be my daughter. The room fell silent. Chloe blinked, trying to process his words. Your daughter. Matthew nodded, his voice softer now. I lost my daughter, Haley, 20 years ago. She disappeared during a family trip to Florida, and we never found her. But the pendant you're wearing, it's the same one I gave her, and the timeline. It all fits. Chloe's heart raced. But how could I be your daughter? I was raised by Karen. She found me in a village in Florida when I was a baby. That's all I know. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes full of hope. Then we need to find out more. There's a connection here, Chloe. I can feel it. I've hired someone to look into your past, but I need your help. Do you remember anything about the village where Karen found you? Anything at all?" Chloe shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "I was just a baby. I don't remember anything." And Karen didn't like to talk about it. She only ever said it was a small village by the water. Matthew sighed, leaning back. "It's not much to go on, but it's a start. We'll figure it out." "Why does this matter so much to you?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Because if you're Haley," Matthew said, his voice breaking slightly, "then I've spent 20 years grieving for nothing. And if someone took you from me, I need to know who and why." Meanwhile, in her private suite, Veronica paced back and forth, her mind racing. The investigator Matthew had hired was getting too close to the truth, and she knew it was only a matter of time before her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Pulling out her phone, she made a call. "We have a problem," she said sharply. "What kind of problem?" A voice on the other end asked. "My brother's digging into the past. He's starting to connect the dots about Haley and that girl on the ship." "You said the girl was just a loose end," the voice replied, irritation creeping into its tone. "She was supposed to be," Veronica snapped, "but now she's turning into a liability. You need to handle this before Matthew gets too close." There was a pause on the line before the voice replied, "Consider it done, but this won't come cheap." "Just take care of it," Veronica said, ending the call. Later that night, Chloe sat in the quiet of her cabin, replaying her conversation with Matthew in her mind. Could it really be true? Could she be the daughter of a millionaire who had spent decades searching for her? Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. Expecting Elena, she opened it without hesitation, only to find 2 men in dark uniforms standing there. "Miss Mitchell," one of them said, his tone cold. "We need you to come with us." Chloe's stomach twisted. "Why? What's going on now?" "Just come with us," the man said, his expression unreadable. Chloe hesitated, but before she could protest, the men stepped inside and grabbed her by the arms. Panic surged through her as they dragged her down the corridor, ignoring her shouts and demands for an explanation. They brought her to a storage room deep in the ship's lower decks and shoved her inside. Locking the door behind her, the room was dark and filled with the faint smell of salt and oil. "Hey!" Chloe yelled, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" But there was no response. As she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face, a chilling realization hit her. Whoever these men were, they weren't acting on behalf of the ship's security. This was something else entirely. In his suite, Matthew received a call from his investigator. "We've confirmed it," the man said. "Chloe's story matches the timeline of your daughter's disappearance, and there's more. You're not going to like it." "What is it?" Matthew asked, his heart pounding. "Veronica," the investigator replied. "She was in Florida at the time Haley disappeared, and there are records that suggest she might have been involved." Matthew's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you saying my sister had something to do with Haley's disappearance?" "All signs point to yes," the investigator said grimly. Matthew's mind raced. If Veronica had taken Haley, what was she hiding? And more importantly, where was Chloe now? Chloe sat in the cold, dark storage room, her mind racing as she tried to piece together everything that had happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had brought her here wasn't just trying to scare her. They wanted her out of the way. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a small vent above the door. It was cluttered with crates and equipment, but nothing immediately useful. She tugged at the door handle again, but it didn't budge. "Think, Chloe," she muttered to herself. "There has to be a way out." Her hands fumbled with the pendant around her neck, a nervous habit that had become second nature. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "They're not going to win. I'll figure this out." Elsewhere on the ship, Matthew paced his suite, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The investigator's words replayed in his mind. Veronica might have been involved. He struggled to process the implications. Could his own sister have orchestrated Haley's disappearance? And if so, why? Picking up his laptop, Matthew searched through old family photos, hoping to find something, anything, that could provide clarity. As he scrolled through the images, his eyes landed on a picture of Haley wearing the star-shaped pendant. She was smiling brightly, her blonde curls catching the sunlight. He closed his laptop with a sigh, determination hardening his resolve. He needed to find Chloe. She was the key to unlocking everything. Chloe's efforts to escape were interrupted by the sound of voices outside the door. She froze, pressing her ear to the cold metal. "She's locked up for now," a gruff voice said. "Good," another voice replied. "We don't need her causing more trouble. Carter's already sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." Chloe's heart pounded. They were talking about Matthew. What do we do if he keeps digging? Leave that to Veronica. She's calling the shots. Chloe's breath hitched. Veronica. The name sounded familiar. Matthew had mentioned her during their conversation. Hadn't he? She racked her brain, trying to remember what he had said. The voices faded as the men walked away, leaving Chloe alone with her thoughts. Whoever Veronica was, she seemed to be at the center of everything. Matthew stormed down the corridor toward the captain's quarters. He had demanded a meeting, unwilling to waste another moment waiting for answers when he arrived. The captain greeted him with a wary expression. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns, but this is highly irregular." "Irregular," Matthew snapped. "My daughter disappeared 20 years ago, and now a young woman who could be her is locked in some room on your ship. You call that irregular?" The captain stiffened. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that there's something happening on this ship that you're either too blind to see or too complicit to admit," Matthew said, his voice low and dangerous. The captain hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. I'll authorize a search for Miss Mitchell, but you'll have to give me time." "Time is a luxury she doesn't have," Matthew said. Turning on his heel and leaving the office, back in the storage room, Chloe spotted a loose panel in the wall near the crates. Desperation gave her strength as she pried it open with a piece of broken wood she had found. Behind the panel was a narrow passageway filled with pipes and wires. It wasn't much of an escape route, but it was her only option. She squeezed through the opening, the metal edges scraping against her arms. The passage was cramped and hot, but she forced herself forward, her determination outweighing her discomfort. After what felt like an eternity, Chloe emerged in another part of the ship. She was disoriented, but the adrenaline pumping through her veins kept her moving. She needed to find Matthew. He was the only person she could trust right now. Matthew was searching the lower decks when his phone buzzed. It was his investigator again. "I've got more for you," the man said. "And it's big." Matthew stepped into a quiet corner, his pulse quickening. "What did you find?" "Bank records," the investigator replied. "Large sums of money transferred from your family's accounts around the time Haley disappeared. They were funneled into offshore accounts controlled by Veronica." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Why would she do that?" "I think she wanted control," the investigator said. "Control of the family fortune, the business, everything. Haley was the heir, wasn't she?" "Yes," Matthew said bitterly. "She was supposed to inherit it all. Then Veronica had every reason to make her disappear," the investigator concluded. Matthew's grip on the phone tightened. "Where's Veronica now?" "She's on the ship," the investigator said. "And I'd bet anything she's pulling the strings behind this smuggling operation, too." Chloe finally made her way to the guest suites, her heart pounding as she knocked on Matthew's door. He opened it quickly, his eyes widening in shock. "Chloe?" he exclaimed. "Are you okay?" "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help. Someone locked me in a storage room. They're trying to frame me for something I didn't do. And they mentioned Veronica." Matthew's expression darkened. "Veronica," he muttered under his breath. "What's going on?" Chloe asked desperately. Matthew hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "I think I know who's behind all of this, but we need to act fast." "Why?" "Because if I'm right," Matthew said, his voice grim, "Veronica isn't just behind the smuggling. She's the reason you ended up here in the first place." Chloe sat stiffly on the couch in Matthew's suite, her hands clasped tightly around the pendant. The room was eerily quiet except for the hum of the ship's engines, but her thoughts were anything but calm. Matthew paced the room, his expression dark and contemplative, the weight of their shared revelations hanging heavily in the air. "Are you absolutely sure they mentioned Veronica?" Matthew asked. Breaking the silence, Chloe nodded. "I heard them say her name, and they said you were digging too deep." Matthew exhaled sharply, leaning against the edge of the desk. It all makes sense now. She's been trying to keep me from the truth for years. But I never thought. I didn't want to believe she could be capable of something like this. What are we going to do? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. She's clearly powerful, and if she's behind the smuggling too, we expose her, Matthew said firmly, his voice laced with determination. But we have to be smart about it. She's careful, and if we make one wrong move, she'll cover her tracks. Chloe hesitated. What if she tries to hurt us? She already locked me in that room. Matthew's jaw tightened. That won't happen again. I'll make sure of it. Meanwhile, in another part of the ship, Veronica sat in her lavish suite, sipping a glass of wine. She gazed out the window at the endless ocean, her mind racing. She had worked too hard, manipulated too many people to let everything unravel now. Her phone buzzed, and she answered quickly. What is it? She got out. The voice on the other end said. Veronica's grip on her glass tightened. How? Not sure, but Carter's with her now. They're starting to put things together. Veronica swore under her breath. Then we move faster, increase security around the shipments, and make sure they don't have access to anything. I'll handle Carter myself. And the girl? The voice asked. Veronica paused, her lips curling into a cold smile. She's more useful alive, for now. But if she gets in my way again, make sure she disappears for good. Chloe and Matthew spent the next few hours strategizing. They decided to start by gathering evidence of the smuggling operation, hoping it would lead them back to Veronica. Chloe, still shaken from her ordeal, insisted on helping, despite Matthew's protests. We're in this together, she said firmly. If she's responsible for what happened to me, and to your daughter, I need to see it through. Matthew reluctantly agreed, impressed by her resolve. All right, but we'll do this carefully. No risks. They began by visiting Elena, Chloe's co-worker who had hinted at suspicious activity. Elena hesitated when she opened the door to them, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. What are you doing here? She whispered. It's not safe. We need your help, Chloe said urgently. You were right about the smuggling and we think Veronica is involved. Elena's face paled. You can't say that name out loud. People are listening. Matthew stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Elena, please, if you know anything that can help us. Now's the time to speak up. After a long pause, Elena nodded. All right, but you didn't hear this from me. She explained how she had seen crew members unloading unmarked crates late at night and noticed certain passengers disappearing into restricted areas. I don't know what's inside the crates, she said, but they're definitely hiding something, and they're not above framing people to keep their operation secret. Chloe glanced at Matthew. Like they did to me. Elena nodded grimly. Exactly. Where do they store the crates? Matthew asked. There's a secure storage area below Deck C, Elena said. But you'll need a key card to get in. Only a few people have access. Matthew frowned. Do you know who has one? Elena hesitated, then leaned in closer. The head of security. But be careful. He's not on your side. That night, Chloe and Matthew made their way to Deck C, their hearts pounding with every step. The corridors were eerily quiet, the faint sound of waves crashing against the hull. The only noise, Matthew carried a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. When they reached the storage area, they found the door locked, as expected. Matthew examined the keypad, his mind racing. We'll have to find another way in, he murmured, before Chloe could respond. They heard footsteps approaching, panicking. They ducked behind a stack of crates, holding their breath as the sound grew louder. 2 men in uniforms appeared, one of them carrying a clipboard. Shipment secure, one of them said. Next transfer's scheduled for tomorrow night. The other man nodded. Make sure no one gets near this area. We can't afford another screw-up. Chloe and Matthew exchanged a glance, their suspicions confirmed, as the men moved on. Matthew whispered, We'll come back tomorrow night. That's when we'll get the proof we need. The next morning, Veronica confronted Matthew in the dining area. She was all smiles on the surface, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. Matthew, she said sweetly, taking a seat across from him. I hear you've been quite busy. Matthew forced a polite smile. Just enjoying the cruise. Is that so? Veronica leaned in slightly. Because it seems to me like you're stirring up trouble. You wouldn't want to ruin the Carter family name, would you? Matthew's expression darkened. I'm just following the truth, Veronica. If that ruins the family name, then maybe it's the family that needs to change. Veronica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. Be careful, Matthew. The truth can be dangerous. As she walked away, Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. Veronica wasn't just a threat. She was a predator, and she wasn't about to let them take her down without a fight. The tension between Chloe and Matthew was palpable as they prepared for their risky venture into the secure storage area. Both knew the stakes were high. If they were caught, Veronica wouldn't hesitate to escalate her efforts to silence them. In Matthew's suite, Chloe fidgeted with her pendant, a habit he had noticed and begun to associate with her moments of uncertainty. What if we don't find anything? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll find something, he said with quiet conviction. And if we don't, we'll keep digging until we do. This isn't just about exposing Veronica. It's about finding out who you really are. Chloe nodded, but her nerves didn't ease. You're so sure I'm your daughter, she said, looking up at him. But what if I'm not? Matthew's gaze softened. Chloe, everything points to it. The timeline, the pendant, the village. It all fits. And even if it didn't, I'd still want to help you. No one deserves to go through this alone. Her eyes filled with gratitude. But before she could respond, Matthew's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and answered quickly. I've got more for you, the investigator said on the other end. It's about Veronica. Matthew's expression darkened. What now? Bank records show that Veronica didn't just siphon money for offshore accounts. She also made several payments to someone in Florida right around the time Haley disappeared. Matthew's grip on the phone tightened. Who? A private investigator? He specialized in... The line crackled for a moment. Disappearing children. Matthew felt a knot form in his stomach. You're telling me she hired someone to make Haley vanish? Looks that way, the investigator replied grimly. But I'm still piecing together the details. Keep me updated, Matthew said before hanging up. What's wrong? Chloe asked, watching the tension in his posture. Matthew hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Veronica's involvement is deeper than I thought, but we'll talk about that later. Right now, we need to focus on tonight. As darkness fell over the ship, Chloe and Matthew made their way to Deck C. Careful to avoid the security cameras, the air was thick with anticipation, and Chloe's heart pounded in her chest. When they reached the secure storage area, they crouched behind a stack of crates, waiting for the guards to make their rounds. Matthew checked his watch. 5 minutes, he whispered. Chloe nodded, gripping the small flashlight in her hand. And then what? We slip inside and document everything we find, Matthew said. Photos, videos, whatever we can get. When the guards finally moved out of sight, they crept toward the door. Matthew pulled out a small tool he had borrowed from one of the maintenance staff earlier in the day. He worked quickly on the keypad, and after a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. Inside, the storage room was dimly lit and lined with rows of unmarked crates. Chloe's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sheer number of them. This is massive, she whispered. Matthew nodded, already prying open one of the crates. Inside, they found stacks of cash, bundles of jewelry, and what appeared to be counterfeit documents. This isn't just smuggling, Matthew said, snapping photos with his phone. This is organized crime. Chloe moved to another crate and opened it cautiously. Her stomach turned when she saw rows of small, unmarked vials. What is this? She asked, holding one up to the light. Matthew took the vial and examined it closely. Drugs, maybe, or something worse. We need to get this to the authorities. Before they could investigate further, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Chloe and Matthew froze, their eyes meeting in panic. They're coming back, Chloe whispered. Matthew quickly closed the crate and motioned for her to follow him. They slipped into a narrow gap between two rows of crates, holding their breath as the door opened. Check everything, a voice commanded. Chloe's heart raced as she watched two men move through the room, their flashlights sweeping over the crates. She clutched Matthew's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Relax, Matthew mouthed, though his own pulse was thundering in his ears. The men lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving. As the door clicked shut behind them, Chloe exhaled shakily. That was too close. Matthew nodded. We've got enough for now. Let's get out of here. Back in Matthew's suite, they reviewed the photos and videos, their findings confirming the scale of the operation. Chloe sat back, her mind racing. This is all tied to Veronica, isn't it? Matthew nodded grimly. It has to be. She's using the cruise line as a front for smuggling, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to keep it hidden. But why? Chloe asked. Why go to all this trouble? Matthew hesitated, then met her gaze. Because she wanted control of everything. The family business, the money, the power, and Haley was in her way. Chloe's stomach churned. You think she got rid of Haley so she could have it all? Yes, Matthew said, his voice heavy with anger. And now, she's trying to cover her tracks. But we're going to stop her. In her suite, Veronica sat at her desk, reviewing a report from one of her associates. Her phone buzzed, and she answered it with a sharp, "What? We've got a problem." The voice on the other end said, "Carter and the girl were in the storage area tonight. They've seen too much." Veronica's expression darkened. "Handle it. I don't care how, but make sure they're silenced. Permanently." The next morning, Chloe woke to the sound of Matthew's urgent knocking on her cabin door. Her heart raced as she swung it open, finding him standing there, his expression a mix of determination and worry. "Get dressed," he said. "We need to move quickly." "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "They know we were in the storage room," Matthew said, lowering his voice. "Veronica's people are going to come after us." Chloe froze, her blood running cold. "How do you know?" Matthew held up his phone, showing her a message from his investigator. "They're on to you. Leave no trail. We can't stay here," he continued. "If we're going to take Veronica down, we need to act fast." Minutes later, they were seated in a quiet corner of the ship's cafe. Going over their next steps, Matthew pulled up the photos and videos they had taken in the storage area, scrolling through them with a furrowed brow. "We have enough to expose the smuggling operation," he said. "But we need to link it directly to Veronica." Chloe nodded, though her mind was racing. "How do we do that without tipping her off?" Matthew leaned back, considering their options. Veronica has always been meticulous, but she has one weakness, her pride. If we push her, she might make a mistake. Chloe frowned. "What do you mean?" "She likes to control the narrative," Matthew explained. "If she thinks she's losing control, she'll try to reassert it. We just have to create the right situation." Chloe didn't fully understand, but she trusted Matthew. "What's the plan?" "We'll confront her," Matthew said. "Publicly, she won't be able to help herself." That evening, the ship's grand ballroom was alive with another extravagant event. Guests in glittering attire mingled under the dazzling chandeliers, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Chloe felt out of place as she stood at the edge of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd for Veronica. "There she is," Matthew said, nodding toward a corner where Veronica was deep in conversation with a group of elite passengers. She wore a fitted black dress, her posture regal and commanding. "Are you sure about this?" Chloe asked, her nerves getting the better of her. Matthew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just follow my lead." As they approached, Veronica looked up, her expression shifting from pleasant to icy in an instant. "Matthew," she said, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "What a surprise, and Miss Mitchell. I didn't expect to see you here." Chloe bit back a retort, letting Matthew take the lead. "Veronica?" Matthew began, his tone sharp. "We need to talk." Veronica raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Is something wrong?" Matthew didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know what you've been doing, the smuggling, the offshore accounts, and what you did to Haley." The color drained from Veronica's face, but she quickly recovered, laughing dismissively. "Matthew, I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you feeling all right?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Matthew snapped, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "You had Haley taken so you could take control of the family fortune. And now, you're running an illegal smuggling operation from this ship." Gasps rippled through the crowd as people turned to watch the confrontation. Veronica's eyes darted around the room, her composure slipping for the first time. "You've lost your mind," she hissed, stepping closer to Matthew. "Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of?" Matthew held up his phone, showing her the photos from the storage room. I have proof, Veronica, and I'm not the only one who knows. Veronica's mask of confidence cracked further. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice faltering. You're ruining our family's reputation over baseless accusations? Matthew's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. You were my sister. I trusted you, but you betrayed me, and you betrayed Haley. At the mention of Haley's name, Veronica's facade crumbled. For a moment, she looked genuinely shaken, but her expression quickly hardened again. You don't understand, she said, her voice low and venomous. I did what I had to do. Chloe stepped forward, her voice firm. You didn't have to destroy lives to get what you wanted. You chose to. Veronica turned her glare to Chloe. You don't know anything about what it takes to survive in this world. You're just a naive girl who doesn't belong here. Chloe didn't flinch. Maybe I don't, but I know one thing. You're going to pay for what you've done. Veronica stormed out of the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Matthew and Chloe followed at a safe distance. Determined not to let her slip away, she disappeared into a restricted area. But Matthew was quick to bypass the security lock with a code he had obtained earlier. Inside, they found Veronica frantically searching through a safe, pulling out stacks of documents and a small black ledger. Chloe immediately began recording with her phone. Looking for something? Matthew asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Veronica whirled around, her face a mask of fury. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, she spat. This is bigger than you can imagine. Then let's make it simple, Matthew said. Hand over the ledger. Veronica clutched the book to her chest, her hands trembling. You think this will fix everything. It won't bring Haley back. No, Matthew said, his voice steady, but it will give her justice. The tension in the room was suffocating. Veronica stood frozen, clutching the black ledger as if it were her lifeline, while Matthew and Chloe waited for her next move. The sound of the ship's engines hummed faintly in the background, an eerie contrast to the charged silence. You don't understand, Veronica hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. If you take this ledger, you'll destroy everything. Our family, our legacy, everything Father worked for. Matthew stepped forward, his expression cold and resolute. You already destroyed it, Veronica. The moment you decided Haley was expendable, you crossed a line. This ledger doesn't just expose your crimes, it proves how far you were willing to go for your greed. Chloe, standing slightly behind Matthew, felt her stomach churn. She couldn't fathom the kind of person who would sacrifice their own niece for power. Hand it over, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Veronica's eyes darted between the two of them, her grip on the ledger tightening. You think you're heroes. You think you're going to walk out of here and fix everything with this. She laughed bitterly. You're both fools. Before they could react, Veronica bolted toward the door. Matthew lunged, grabbing her arm just as she reached for the handle. The ledger slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Chloe quickly scooped it up, her hands shaking as she held the incriminating evidence. Let go of me, Veronica shouted, struggling against Matthew's grip. Not until you face what you've done, he said through gritted teeth. You can't run from this anymore. Chloe flipped through the ledger, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. It was meticulous, a record of every illicit transaction tied to the smuggling operation, shipments, payouts, and even the names of those involved. But one section caught her attention, a series of payments labeled Florida, H, spanning several months. Matthew, she said, her voice trembling. There are payments here tied to Florida, around the time Haley disappeared. Matthew released Veronica and turned to Chloe, his expression darkening. What does it say? Chloe handed him the ledger, pointing to the entries. It's not detailed, but these payments are connected to someone with the initial H, and they line up with the timeline you told me. Matthew's face hardened as he processed the information. This is it, he said quietly. This proves she was involved. Veronica, regaining her composure, sneered. You don't have the full story. You never did. Then why don't you enlighten us? Matthew challenged, his voice sharp. Veronica hesitated, the weight of her secrets pressing down on her. Finally, she let out a bitter sigh. Fine. You want the truth? I'll give it to you. Yes, I had Haley taken, but it wasn't for the reasons you think. Matthew's breath hitched, his fists clenching at his sides. What reason could possibly justify what you did? She was a threat, Veronica snapped, her voice rising. Father was going to hand everything to her. Everything I worked for. Everything I deserved. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to be cast aside for a child? I wasn't going to let that happen. So you had her kidnapped? Matthew said, his voice shaking with anger. I didn't plan for it to go that far, Veronica admitted, her tone defensive. It was supposed to scare Father, to make him rethink his decision. But the people I hired, they went too far. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. And instead of coming clean, you buried the truth, Matthew said, his eyes blazing. You let us believe she was gone forever. You let me believe I failed as a father. Veronica's gaze faltered for a moment before she straightened, her expression hardening once again. I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again if it meant keeping what's mine. Chloe felt her hands tremble as she listened to the exchange. Her entire world was shifting, the pieces of her past falling into place in ways she never imagined. What happened to Haley? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where did they take her? Veronica smirked. That's the thing about secrets, dear. Sometimes they die with the people who keep them. Chloe and Matthew left the room, the ledger clutched tightly in Chloe's hands. They needed to regroup and figure out their next steps. But the weight of Veronica's confession hung heavily between them. Back in Matthew's suite, they sat in silence for a moment before Chloe spoke. Do you think she's telling the truth? About it going too far? Matthew shook his head. I don't know. Veronica's always been a master manipulator, but one thing's clear. She was behind Haley's disappearance. And now, we have the proof to hold her accountable. What about the payments? Chloe asked, gesturing to the ledger. Do you think they'll lead us to more answers? Matthew studied the entries again, his jaw tightening. They might. Whoever H is, they were involved. And if they're still alive, they might know what happened to Haley. Chloe swallowed hard, the pendant around her neck feeling heavier than ever. Do you think I could be her? Matthew reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. I do, Chloe. And if you are, I'll do everything in my power to make up for the years we lost. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but she blinked them away. Then let's finish this for Haley. For both of you, Matthew corrected, his voice filled with quiet determination. In her suite, Veronica sat alone, staring out at the ocean. For the first time in years, her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. But she wasn't finished yet. If Matthew and Chloe wanted a fight, she was prepared to give them one. The ship's corridors were quiet, as Chloe and Matthew made their way to meet Elena. The ledger, tucked securely in Matthew's satchel, felt like both a burden and a weapon. A tool that could bring Veronica down but also put them in greater danger. You're sure Elena can help us? Chloe asked, glancing over her shoulder. She's the only one who's been willing to tell the truth so far, Matthew said. If anyone can point us in the right direction, it's her. When they arrived at Elena's cabin, she greeted them with nervous energy, her eyes darting up and down the hallway before pulling them inside. You shouldn't be here, she whispered urgently. Veronica's people are everywhere. If they catch you, they won't, Matthew interrupted. But we need your help. We have proof of the smuggling operation, and we're close to tying it to Veronica. But there are still missing pieces. Elena frowned, crossing her arms. What kind of missing pieces? Chloe stepped forward, holding the ledger. Do you recognize this? Elena's eyes widened as she scanned the pages. I've seen similar ledgers before, she said. The crew passes them around during shipments, but I never saw one with this much detail. Matthew pointed to the entries marked Florida, H. We need to know who this refers to. It could lead us to someone who knows what happened to Haley, or prove Chloe's identity. Elena hesitated, her fingers tapping against the edge of the ledger. There's a man who might know, she said finally. He works in the engine room, goes by Ramirez. If anyone's involved with the logistics of these shipments, it's him. Can you get us to him? Matthew asked. Elena nodded. But it won't be easy. He's heavily guarded. Later that evening, Elena led them through a series of narrow passageways toward the engine room. The air was hot and heavy with the smell of oil, the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines growing louder with every step. When they reached a small side entrance, Elena stopped and turned to them. "This is as far as I can go without raising suspicion," she said. "Ramirez should be in there, but be careful. He's not the kind of man who gives away information easily." "Thank you," Chloe said, her voice sincere. Elena nodded and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Chloe and Matthew to face whatever lay ahead. Inside the engine room, the noise was deafening. Workers moved between machinery, shouting orders over the roar of the engines. Chloe and Matthew scanned the space, their eyes landing on a stocky man with a grizzled beard standing near a control panel. "That's him," Matthew said, motioning for Chloe to follow as they approached. Ramirez turned, his expression wary. "Who are you?" he barked. "We need to talk," Matthew said, keeping his tone steady. "It's about the shipments." Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Chloe stepped forward, holding up the ledger. "We found this. We know about the smuggling, and we know you're involved." Ramirez's face darkened, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he glanced at the ledger. "You two have no idea what you're messing with," he growled. "If Veronica finds out you're here, she already knows," Matthew said. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is what you know about these payments to H in Florida. Who is it?" Ramirez hesitated, his gaze shifting to the workers around them. "I can't talk here," he muttered. "Meet me on Decky in an hour. I'll tell you what I know. But if you bring anyone else, the deal's off." An hour later, Chloe and Matthew waited in a secluded corner of Deck E. The ship was quieter now, the hum of conversation and music from the upper decks faint in the background. "Do you think he'll show?" Chloe asked nervously. "He will," Matthew said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Moments later, Ramirez appeared, his eyes scanning the area before approaching them. "All right," he said gruffly. "I'll tell you what I know, but if this gets back to Veronica, I'm as good as dead." "We understand," Matthew said. "Just tell us the truth." Ramirez took a deep breath. "The payments to H were for a man named Hector Ruiz. He was hired to handle special cases. If someone needed to disappear, he was the guy to call." Chloe's heart sank. Did he take Haley?" Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Veronica hired him to take the girl. I don't know what happened after that, but I know he was paid to keep her out of the picture. For good." Matthew's fists clenched at his sides. "Where is he now?" "Dead," Ramirez said bluntly. "Killed in a shootout years ago, but if you're looking for records, he kept detailed logs of every job he took. Last I heard, they were hidden in a safety deposit box in Miami." Chloe exchanged a glance with Matthew. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the road ahead was still uncertain. "Thank you," Matthew said. "This helps more than you know." "You didn't hear it from me," Ramirez said, his tone final. Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows. As they returned to Matthew's suite, Chloe felt a sense of both relief and dread. They were closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but the stakes were higher than ever. "What now?" she asked as they entered the room. "We head to Miami," Matthew said. "If Hector's records are there, they'll have the answers we need." "And Veronica?" Chloe asked. Matthew's expression hardened. "She'll get what's coming to her. But first, we finish this." The next morning, Chloe and Matthew found themselves on edge, the weight of their discoveries pressing heavily on them. Their conversation with Ramirez had opened new doors, but it also left them with more questions than answers. As the cruise ship approached its next port, Matthew made arrangements to disembark and head to Miami. "We can't waste any time," Matthew said, scanning through his phone for travel options. "If Hector Ruiz's records are still intact, they'll give us the final pieces we need." "What about Veronica?" Chloe asked, her voice hesitant. Matthew's jaw tightened. "She'll expect us to act. That's why we need to stay ahead of her." Before they could finalize their plans, a knock sounded at the door. Matthew gestured for Chloe to stay back as he opened it cautiously, revealing Elena. She stepped inside quickly, her expression fraught with urgency. "You don't have much time," Elena said, her voice low. "Veronica knows what you're planning. She's put security on high alert to keep you from leaving the ship." Chloe's stomach dropped. "She's trying to trap us here." Elena nodded. "Exactly. She's not going to let either of you walk away with that ledger, and if she catches you..." Matthew cut her off. "We're not letting her stop us. We've come too far to turn back now. Elena hesitated, then handed him a small keycard. This will get you through some of the restricted areas. It's not much, but it might buy you some time. Matthew accepted it with a nod. Thank you, Elena, for everything, using the keycard. Matthew and Chloe navigated the ship's restricted corridors, staying out of sight as much as possible. The hum of the engines and the occasional sound of footsteps kept them on edge, but they moved quickly, their determination outweighing their fear. As they reached the gangway, Chloe stopped, her hand on Matthew's arm. "What if we don't make it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew turned to her, his expression softening. "We will," he said firmly. "Because we have to, for Haley, for you." Chloe nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. Together, they stepped onto the gangway, blending into the small crowd of passengers disembarking at the port. By the time they reached Miami, the tension between them was palpable. The city's bustling streets and bright sunlight felt almost jarring after the confinement of the ship. They wasted no time, heading straight to the bank where Hector Ruiz's safety deposit box was reportedly located, inside the pristine lobby. Matthew approached the counter, presenting the necessary documents Ramirez had mentioned. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions, leading them to a private room where the box was brought in. Matthew opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old notebooks, photographs, and a small stack of documents. Chloe's breath caught as she recognized the pendant in one of the photographs, a perfect match to the one she wore. "This is it," Matthew said, his voice steady but full of emotion. They sifted through the contents, piecing together the story Hector had left behind. One document in particular caught their attention, a signed contract with Veronica's name scrawled at the bottom. It outlined the details of Haley's abduction, confirming everything Ramirez had said. Chloe felt tears sting her eyes as she read the words. "She really did it," she whispered. "She really took her." Matthew clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "And she got away with it for 20 years. Not anymore." Just as they were leaving the bank, Chloe's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake. Turn back now or you'll regret it." Chloe showed the message to Matthew, her hands shaking. "It's her, isn't it?" Matthew nodded grimly. "She knows we're close. That means she's desperate. We have to go to the authorities," Chloe said. "This is more than just smuggling now. She needs to be stopped." Matthew hesitated. "We will. But first, we need to make sure this evidence reaches the right people, if Veronica has connections in law enforcement. She could try to bury it." That night, back at their hotel, Chloe couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out at the Miami skyline, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand. Matthew joined her, sitting silently for a moment before speaking. "You've been through a lot," he said softly. "So have you," Chloe replied, glancing at him. "You lost your daughter. You thought she was gone forever." Matthew nodded, his gaze distant. "And now I might have found her. But I've also learned how much I failed her. And you." Chloe shook her head. "You didn't fail me. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even know the truth about who I am." Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not done yet, but no matter what happens, I want you to know I'm proud of you. You're stronger than you realize." Chloe smiled faintly, the weight on her chest easing slightly. "Thank you." Meanwhile, back on the ship, Veronica was unraveling. She paced her suite, barking orders into her phone. "Find them," she snarled. "I don't care what it takes. They cannot expose me." The person on the other end hesitated. "What if they've already gone to the authorities?" "Then make sure the evidence never sees the light of day," Veronica snapped. "If you fail, it's not just them you'll answer to. It's me." She ended the call and poured herself a glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly. For the first time, Veronica felt the cracks in her carefully constructed empire growing wider. But she wasn't going down without a fight. The tension between Chloe and Matthew was palpable as they prepared their next move. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable, but the weight of what it meant, to Chloe, to Matthew, and to the family Veronica had betrayed, was crushing. The Miami skyline twinkled outside their hotel room, but neither found comfort in its glow. "Tomorrow, we take this to the authorities," Matthew said, breaking the silence. He sat at the edge of the desk, his hands folded as he stared at the damning documents spread before him. Chloe nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Do you think she'll try to stop us? Matthew met her gaze, his expression grim. I don't think... He paused, correcting himself. I know she will. Veronica's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. Chloe clutched the pendant around her neck, her thumb brushing over its cool surface. What if she comes after us before we can get there? We'll be ready, Matthew said, his voice steady. We have the truth on our side. The following morning, as they prepared to leave for the authorities, Matthew's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. It's her, he said, showing Chloe the message. Let's talk. Meet me alone, and we can end this quietly. Chloe's stomach twisted. You're not seriously thinking about meeting her, are you? I don't trust her, Matthew admitted. But if she's willing to talk, it might be our best chance to end this without anyone else getting hurt. She's lying, Chloe said firmly. You know she is. She'll do whatever it takes to protect herself. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe, but if I don't go, she might escalate things. And I can't risk putting you in more danger. Chloe's eyes hardened. Then I'm coming with you. No, Matthew said immediately. It's too risky. I'm not staying behind, Chloe insisted. She's done too much to both of us. I need to see this through. Matthew hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. All right, but we'll do this on our terms. The meeting was arranged for a secluded park near the waterfront, far from the bustling streets of Miami. Matthew and Chloe arrived early, scoping out the area to ensure it wasn't a trap. The air was thick with tension as they waited on a bench near the water, the distant sound of waves adding an ominous backdrop to the moment. Veronica arrived shortly after, dressed impeccably as always, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her expression was calm, almost amused, but the cold glint in her eyes betrayed her true intentions. Matthew, she said smoothly, stopping a few feet away. And Chloe, I wasn't expecting you, but I suppose it's fitting. Cut the act, Veronica, Matthew said sharply. We know everything. The smuggling, the abduction, the lies. It's over. Veronica tilted her head, her smile faint. Over. Oh, Matthew, you've always been so naive. Do you really think you can take me down with a few old papers? We have proof, Chloe interjected, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. The ledger, the contract with Hector Ruiz. It's all here. Veronica's gaze shifted to Chloe, her expression hardening. You have no idea what you're meddling in, little girl. You think this is about justice. It's about survival, our family's survival. Don't you dare talk about family, Matthew snapped, stepping closer. You destroyed our family. You took Haley from me, and you let me believe she was gone forever. All for your greed. Veronica's mask of composure cracked for a moment, her lips tightening. You don't understand what it was like, she said, her voice low and bitter. Father never saw me. I was always in Haley's shadow. I deserved more, Matthew. I earned it. You deserved nothing, Matthew shot back. And now you'll pay for what you've done. Veronica's smile returned, sharp and cold. You think this ends here? I've built an empire, Matthew. You think you can destroy me with a few accusations and some shaky evidence? Chloe stepped forward, holding up her phone. It's not just evidence. We've recorded everything. And once this goes public, there won't be anywhere for you to hide. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Veronica's eyes. You wouldn't dare, she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Try us, Matthew said, his tone steel. Veronica's hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her steps quick and deliberate as they returned to their hotel. Chloe felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. Do you think she'll back down? Matthew shook his head. No, she's too stubborn, too proud, but she's running out of options. What happens now? Chloe asked, her voice quiet. Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression resolute. Now we finish this. No more running, no more hiding. She's going to face the consequences, whether she likes it or not. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room aboard the ship, Veronica stood over her desk, staring at the remnants of her shattered plans. The evidence Chloe and Matthew had gathered was damning, but she wasn't finished yet. Picking up her phone, she made one final call. I need this handled tonight. The voice on the other end hesitated. Are you sure? It's risky. I don't care, Veronica snapped. Do it. I'm not going down without a fight. The tension in the hotel room was suffocating as Chloe and Matthew prepared for their next move. The evidence they had collected was irrefutable, but they knew Veronica wouldn't give up without a fight. Chloe paced the room, clutching her pendant, her thoughts racing. She's not going to stop, Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly. You saw her face at the park. She's desperate. Matthew nodded, his expression grim. Desperation makes people dangerous. We need to stay ahead of her. As they finalized their plans to meet with the authorities, Matthew's phone buzzed. The message was short but chilling. You're not safe. Leave now. Matthew showed Chloe the text, his jaw tightening. She's making her move. Chloe felt a shiver run down her spine. What do? We stick to the plan, Matthew said firmly. We can't let her intimidate us. Later that evening, they left the hotel, keeping a low profile as they made their way to the district attorney's office. The streets of Miami were alive with activity, but Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, her nerves on edge. Stay close, Matthew said. Sensing her unease, they were only a few blocks away when a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of them. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their faces cold and unreadable. Mr. Carter, Miss Mitchell, one of them said, his tone calm but menacing. We need you to come with us. Matthew stepped protectively in front of Chloe. We're not going anywhere with you. The second man pulled out a badge, though it was unclear which agency he represented. This is for your safety. There's a threat against you, and we've been sent to secure you. Chloe's heart pounded. This doesn't feel right, she whispered to Matthew. It's not, he replied under his breath. Then, louder, we're fine, thank you, but we'll handle it from here. The men exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. I'm afraid that's not an option, one of them said, stepping closer. Matthew's instincts kicked in. Run, he shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand and darting into the nearest alley. The chase through the back streets of Miami was chaotic. Matthew and Chloe weaved through narrow alleys and crowded sidewalks, their pursuers close behind. Adrenaline surged through Chloe as she clung to Matthew's hand, her breath coming in short gasps. They're gaining on us, she cried. Matthew spotted a small cafe with an open back door. This way, he said, pulling her inside. They slipped through the kitchen, dodging startled employees, and exited onto another street. The SUV roared past. Moments later, the men inside scanning the area for them, Matthew led Chloe into a nearby hotel lobby, where they blended into a crowd of tourists checking in. Once they were confident they weren't being followed, they ducked into a quiet corner to catch their breath. That wasn't random, Matthew said, his voice low. Veronica sent them. Chloe nodded, her hands trembling. She's trying to stop us before we can expose her. Back at their original hotel, Veronica was pacing her suite, her frustration mounting. Her phone buzzed and she snatched it up, her tone sharp. Well, they slipped away, the voice on the other end admitted. Veronica's jaw tightened. You had one job. Do you have any idea what's at stake? We'll find them, the man promised. It's only a matter of time. Veronica ended the call, her fury barely contained. She knew the walls were closing in, but she wasn't ready to surrender. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared out at the Miami skyline, her mind racing with plans for her next move. Meanwhile, Matthew and Chloe found temporary refuge in a small, family-owned motel on the outskirts of the city. The modest room was a stark contrast to the luxury they had left behind, but it felt safe. For now, Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still shaking. What if they find us again? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't, Matthew assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced. We'll leave first thing in the morning and get this evidence to someone we can trust. Chloe nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. She's not going to stop, is she? Not until she destroys everything. Matthew sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. No, she won't, but she's made one mistake. She underestimated us, and now we have the truth on our side. Chloe looked up at him, finding strength in his determination. Then we finish this, she said. For Haley, for all of us. Matthew replied. That night, as Chloe lay awake, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her. She clutched the pendant around her neck, her mind racing with questions. What would they find in the end? Would they ever truly be free of Veronica's grasp? In the silence of the room, Matthew sat by the window, keeping watch. His thoughts drifted to Haley, to the years of pain and unanswered questions. Now, so much of it made sense, but the revelations only deepened his anger and his resolve. We're close, he muttered to himself. We're so close. Veronica, meanwhile, was preparing for her final play. She picked up her phone and made a call. Double the security around the remaining shipments, she ordered. And send someone to watch the district attorney's office. If Carter or the girl show up there, I want to know immediately. Understood, the voice replied. Veronica ended the call and leaned back in her chair, a cold smile playing on her lips. Let's see how far they're willing to go. The morning sun filtered through the thin motel curtains, casting a dim light over the small room where Chloe and Matthew had spent a restless night. They both knew the day ahead could change everything. Either they would finally expose Veronica's crimes, or they would fall victim to her relentless schemes. Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the pendant around her neck. Do you think the authorities will even listen to us? She asked, her voice tinged with doubt. They will, Matthew said, zipping up the satchel containing the ledger and other evidence. We have everything we need to prove Veronica's guilt. She won't be able to talk her way out of this. Chloe wanted to believe him, but a part of her couldn't shake the fear that Veronica's influence extended further than they realized. The drive to the district attorney's office was tense. Matthew kept glancing at the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs of pursuit. Chloe sat in silence, her fingers nervously tapping against her knee. Almost there, Matthew said as they turned onto a quieter street. But as they approached the office, Chloe's stomach dropped. A black SUV was parked just outside the entrance, and two men in dark suits were stationed near the doors. They're here, she whispered. Matthew's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Of course they are. What do we do now? Chloe asked, her voice laced with panic. We need a backup plan, Matthew said, pulling into a nearby alley to avoid being seen. He parked the car and turned to Chloe. Do you still have Ramirez's contact information? Chloe nodded, pulling out her phone. Why? We need someone on the inside who can help us, Matthew explained. If we can get the evidence to someone with ties to law enforcement but outside of Veronica's reach, we might have a chance. Minutes later, Ramirez answered the call, his tone cautious. I thought I told you to leave me out of this. We don't have a choice, Matthew said. Veronica's people are everywhere, and we can't get to the district attorney's office without being intercepted. We need someone we can trust to get this evidence to the right place. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter, Ramirez said finally. But I'll help you. Meet me at the abandoned shipyard near the docks. Bring everything. The abandoned shipyard was a stark contrast to the chaos they had faced so far. The massive steel structures loomed overhead, casting long shadows in the early afternoon sun. Matthew and Chloe parked the car and stepped out, clutching the satchel tightly. This feels like a trap, Chloe said, her eyes scanning the area. It's the best chance we've got, Matthew replied, his tone resolute. Ramirez appeared moments later, stepping out from behind a shipping container. He raised a hand in greeting, but his expression was serious. You brought the ledger. Matthew nodded and handed him the satchel. Everything's in there. The ledger, the photos, the documents, everything we've collected. Ramirez opened the bag and flipped through its contents, his brow furrowing. This is solid, he said. If it gets to the right people, it'll bury her. So, what now? Chloe asked. I'll deliver this to someone I trust, Ramirez said. But you two need to lay low. If Veronica realizes what's happening, she won't hesitate to come after you. As Ramirez walked away, Matthew and Chloe turned to head back to the car. But before they could reach it, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A second black SUV barreled into the shipyard, its headlights cutting through the shadows. It's her people, Chloe said, panic rising in her voice. Run! Matthew shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a maze of shipping containers. The sound of footsteps and shouts echoed behind them as the men from the SUV gave chase. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest as she ducked around corners and squeezed through narrow gaps, doing her best to keep up with Matthew. "We can't keep running," she panted. "They'll catch us." Matthew scanned their surroundings, his eyes landing on a rusted ladder leading to the top of a container stack. "This way," he said, motioning for her to climb. Chloe hesitated for only a moment before scrambling up the ladder. Matthew followed, pulling it up behind him to slow their pursuers. From their vantage point, they could see the men spreading out below, searching for them. "What do we do now?" Chloe whispered. Matthew's mind raced. "We wait for Ramirez to get away. If he can deliver the evidence, it won't matter what happens to us." Chloe shook her head. "It matters to me," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not losing you after everything we've been through." Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "You won't, I promise." Meanwhile, Ramirez sped through the streets of Miami, the satchel secured on the passenger seat. He knew time was against him, but he also knew the weight of what he was carrying. This evidence could not only take down Veronica, but also expose the entire smuggling network operating from the cruise line. As he approached the address he had been given, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "They're coming for you. Don't stop." Back at the shipyard, the sound of shouts grew louder as the men closed in. Matthew and Chloe held their breath, hoping the shadows would keep them hidden. But then, one of the men shouted, "Up there!" Chloe's eyes widened as she realized they had been spotted. "They're coming!" Matthew scanned their surroundings, his mind racing. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm but firm. As the men began climbing the stack of containers, Matthew prepared himself for the confrontation ahead. He knew they were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let Veronica win. The clanging of boots against the steel containers echoed through the shipyard as Veronica's men climbed closer to Matthew and Chloe's precarious perch. Matthew's pulse raced, but his mind remained sharp. They had come too far to lose everything now. "Stay low," Matthew whispered to Chloe. "Whatever happens, don't let them get to you." Chloe nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the container. "What are you going to do?" "Buy us time," he replied, his voice firm. Before she could argue, Matthew moved to the edge of the stack and grabbed a loose piece of rusted metal. As the first man's head appeared over the side, Matthew swung hard, the makeshift weapon connecting with a sickening clang. The man yelped in pain, losing his grip and falling back onto the container below. A second man appeared, more cautious than the first. Matthew stood his ground, blocking his access to Chloe. "You don't want to do this," he warned. The man smirked, pulling out a baton. "You're outnumbered, Carter. This won't end well for you." Matthew's grip on the rusted metal tightened. "I've heard that before." Down below, the shouts and clatter drew the attention of nearby dock workers, who began gathering at a distance. Curious but hesitant to intervene, the scene was chaotic. Matthew defending Chloe from the advancing men, the workers murmuring among themselves, and the faint sound of sirens growing louder in the background. Chloe's eyes darted around the shipyard, searching for anything that could help. Spotting a pile of heavy chains nearby, she quickly formed a plan. "Matthew," she called, tossing him one of the chains, catching it mid-air. Matthew swung the chain with precision, knocking the baton from the second man's hand. Seizing the opportunity, he lunged forward and shoved the man off the container, sending him sprawling onto the ground below. As the men regrouped, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Chloe's heart leapt as Ramirez's car sped into view. Skidding to a stop near the commotion, he stepped out, holding up the satchel containing the evidence. "You want this?" Ramirez shouted at the men. "Come and get it." The distraction was enough to draw their attention away from Matthew and Chloe. Two of the men abandoned their pursuit and raced toward Ramirez, who took off running through the maze of containers. "Go," Matthew urged Chloe, helping her climb down the other side of the stack. "We have to back him up." Ramirez led the men on a wild chase, using his intimate knowledge of the shipyard to stay one step ahead. Ducking behind a container, he fished his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. "This is Ramirez," he said quickly. "I'm at the shipyard and I've got the evidence. Send backup now." As he ended the call, one of the men rounded the corner. Ramirez swung the satchel, striking the man square in the chest and knocking him to the ground. Before he could recover, Ramirez disappeared into the shadows. Meanwhile, Matthew and Chloe navigated the maze of containers, determined to reach Ramirez before it was too late. The sound of shouting and heavy footsteps guided them, and soon they spotted him darting between crates with 2 men in pursuit. "There!" Matthew shouted, motioning for Chloe to follow. As they closed the distance, one of the men caught up to Ramirez and tackled him to the ground. The satchel spilled open, its contents scattering across the dirt. Chloe gasped as the incriminating ledger fell into plain view. Matthew didn't hesitate. He charged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and pulling him off Ramirez. The 2 men grappled, their movements wild and desperate. Chloe rushed to Ramirez's side, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Ramirez said, wincing as he dusted himself off. "Get the ledger." Chloe scrambled to collect the scattered documents, her heart racing as she stuffed them back into the satchel. The fight between Matthew and the man was brutal, each blow fueled by desperation, but Matthew's resolve won out, and with one final punch, he sent the man sprawling. "Let's go!" Matthew shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand as they sprinted toward the edge of the shipyard. Ramirez followed close behind, clutching the satchel tightly. The remaining men gave chase, but their pursuit was cut short by the arrival of police cars, their sirens blaring. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. Chloe froze, her breath hitching as she watched the chaos unfold. Matthew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. Veronica arrived moments later, stepping out of a sleek black car with her usual air of confidence. But as she saw the police securing the area and her men being handcuffed, her composure faltered. "Matthew," she said, her voice dripping with disdain as she approached him. "This won't change anything." "It already has," Matthew replied, holding up the satchel. "Everything you've done is in here, Veronica. The smuggling, the kidnapping, all of it. And now, everyone's going to know." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "No." "Veronica," Matthew said, his voice steady. "You did, 20 years ago, when you chose greed over family." As the police escorted Veronica away, Chloe felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the nightmare might finally be ending. Matthew turned to her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. "We did it," he said. Chloe nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "We did." But deep down, she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, still truths to uncover, and for the first time, she felt ready to face them. The shipyard was quiet now, the chaos of the confrontation giving way to a sense of uneasy calm. Chloe and Matthew stood side by side as the last of Veronica's men were loaded into police cars, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. The incriminating evidence was now safely in the hands of the authorities. And for the first time in weeks, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter. "I can't believe it's over," Chloe said softly, her fingers brushing against the pendant around her neck. "It's not entirely over," Matthew replied, "but it's a start. Veronica will face justice and everything she's done will come to light." Chloe nodded, though a lingering doubt remained in her mind. "What about me? What if I'm not Haley? What if all of this—" She gestured toward the shipyard. "What if it doesn't lead to the answers we're looking for?" Matthew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Chloe, no matter what the truth is, you're not alone anymore. We'll face whatever comes next together." The next few days passed in a blur. Matthew and Chloe worked closely with the authorities, providing statements and handing over every piece of evidence they had collected. Veronica's smuggling operation unraveled quickly as investigators followed the trail laid out in the ledger. High-profile arrests were made across multiple cities, and news outlets buzzed with updates on the case. Chloe couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication, though it was bittersweet. She thought about Karen, the woman who had raised her, and wondered what she would think of everything that had happened. "She always said I was meant for something bigger," Chloe murmured to herself one evening. "What's that?" Matthew asked, stepping into the room. Chloe smiled faintly. "Karen, she used to tell me that I was special, that I had a purpose, I think. Maybe this was it." Matthew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's only the beginning." A week later, Matthew and Chloe found themselves standing outside a modest building in Miami, a DNA testing center. Chloe's heart raced as they stepped inside, the gravity of the moment pressing down on her. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice wavering. Matthew smiled gently. "I've never been more sure of anything." The test itself was quick and uneventful, but the waiting felt endless. Chloe tried to distract herself by exploring the city, but her thoughts always drifted back to the test results. What if she wasn't Haley? What if she wasn't who Matthew hoped she was? 3 days later, the results arrived. Sitting in Matthew's hotel room, Chloe stared at the envelope in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. She scanned the words quickly, her breath catching as she reached the bottom. "Well?" Matthew asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Chloe looked up, tears streaming down her face. "It's a match," she whispered. "I'm Haley." Matthew's shoulders sagged with relief, his own eyes brimming with tears. He reached out and pulled Chloe into a tight embrace. "I knew it," he said softly. "I knew it all along." Chloe clung to him, a mix of emotions swirling in her chest: relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly knew who she was. In the weeks that followed, Chloe and Matthew began to rebuild the life they had lost. The media frenzy surrounding the case died down, and Veronica's trial loomed on the horizon. Matthew used his resources to ensure Chloe had everything she needed: a home, education, and a fresh start. But it wasn't just material support he offered. Matthew made it clear that he was committed to being the father Chloe had missed for so many years. They spent hours talking about the past, sharing memories, and dreaming about the future. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach, Chloe stopped and turned to Matthew. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if Veronica hadn't done what she did?" Matthew sighed, his gaze distant. "I do, all the time. But then I think about how strong you've become, how resilient, and I realize that, as much as I hate what happened, it made you who you are." Chloe smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "And I wouldn't trade who I am now for anything." On the day of Veronica's trial, Chloe and Matthew sat in the courtroom, their presence a silent testament to her crimes. Veronica, once so composed and untouchable, looked smaller than Chloe had ever seen her. As the prosecution laid out the evidence, Chloe felt a sense of closure begin to settle over her. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Chloe reached for Matthew's hand. He squeezed it gently, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had endured together. Months later, Chloe stood in the doorway of her new apartment, the sunlight streaming in behind her. She had started working with a nonprofit organization that helped victims of trafficking and smuggling. Determined to use her experiences to make a difference, Matthew visited often, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. On one visit, he handed her a small box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to reveal a new star-shaped pendant. "A reminder," Matthew said, "that no matter where life takes you, you'll always have a home with me." Chloe smiled, tears welling up in her eyes as she hugged him. "Thank you, Dad." As she stood on the balcony that evening, gazing out at the city lights, Chloe felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought her to a place of strength and purpose. For the first time, she truly believed in her mother's words. She was meant for something bigger,